Okay. How's everybody doing today? Okay, let's jump back in, shall we? So we're talking about the nutrition section of the digestive system chapter. And so first thing we want to do is talk a little bit about basal metabolism. And so ultimately, when you take a look at basal metabolism, this is like your kind of foundation, right? So your baseline, if you will, of what you're doing metabolically. So when you're at rest, the amount of energy you need to just keep the lights on, so to speak, and everything moving forward, that's your basal metabolism. So that's kind of like your starting point. And this will change depending on what's going on in your body and in your life, right? So for instance, this is not your total caloric need, right? This is just the baseline to keep everything functioning. On top of that, then you've got everything you need for things like exercise. So if you're routinely working out, then your body is constantly in kind of the expectation that it's going to be working out, which means it's in the expectation that it's going to need more energy, because you're kind of basically working at sort of a higher, kind of like a higher functional level, right? So that's basically what happens when you exercise. So your basal metabolism kind of starts to increase a little bit because your engines, so to speak, are warmed up and they're constantly kind of revving a little bit higher. If you've ever gone into athletics or anything like that, where you're constantly practicing like every day, or you're going to practice, or you're working out or training every day, you'll know that your metabolic rate like goes up, and it's like you're hungry all the time. It's like you just want to eat everything, and that's because you're kind of adjusting your basal metabolic rate to kind of shift it up higher because it's expecting to do more. And so ultimately then, the good thing about this is that the higher your basal metabolic rate, the more calories you're going to burn. And that's kind of part of the process of the idea of exercise, right? So like when usually you think of two different things when you're thinking about things like losing weight, which I'm going to have to do here in a couple of months because I always pork up over the holidays. But you think of two things, right? The first one you think about is dieting. And the second one you think about is exercise. Well, dieting kind of makes sense, right? Because ultimately when you're talking about dieting, what you're essentially doing is you're trying to adjust your incoming calories to match your metabolic need. And the idea is if you eat more calories than your body requires for its energetic demands, then that's when it gets packed away and stored as fat. And so the idea then is if you are at a state where you've shifted that metric where your body is requiring more energy than the calories that you're giving it, then it's going to take from that storage, and that's kind of where you get to the weight loss idea, right? So the two really go hand in hand. It's kind of like gas in an engine, right? So you can't have productivity without both. And so when you're exercising, what you're doing is you're basically creating a scenario physiologically in your body where you require more calories to function, and then of course you consume those calories. So as long as your metabolic demand exceeds your calories, or rather we should say whether your calories don't exceed your metabolic demand, then you're not going to gain weight, right? But typically speaking, when you do have a higher metabolic demand, it tends to make you hungry, right? That's kind of your physiological response, because the idea is your body is thinking, wait a minute, we're burning a lot of energy here. You have to eat because we need more energy. And so what happens is you tend to eat, which then supplies that caloric need with the food that you ate, as opposed to your fat reserves, if that's what you're trying to go after, right? And so ultimately, you have to consume more than your body needs in order to gain weight. And generally speaking, there's kind of like a rule of thumb in terms of like the calories that your body needs. Somebody came up with a formula that it's about maybe 10 times your ideal weight, right? So if you say, okay, my ideal weight would be about 150, then on average, your kind of floor of your required calories would be like around 1,500, right? And so the idea would be then if you're eating fewer calories to kind of get down to that 1,500, then your body is going to be burning more calories than you're taking in, and that's going to lead to weight loss. Of course, you always want to be careful, right? Because ultimately, if you're burning too many calories, then your body's going to get out of balance as well. So they kind of go hand in hand, and this is one of the reasons why the idea of exercise and diet is emphasizing more of sustainable lifestyle changes, right? Not necessarily just, never seeing your treadmill until January 1st when the guilt of binge eating has come to you. And then you realize, wait a minute, I got to pull that thing out of the basement and dust it off a little bit, and maybe get on it and actually do something. The idea there is like, well, you don't want to do that, right? Because that's like binge exercising, which is just about as useful as binge eating. And so what you really want to do is you want to get into a habit, like find a physical activity that you love and that you enjoy and do it all the time, right? Like for me personally, I love riding my bike. And if it weren't for snow and ice, I'd probably ride it all year long. But that's something I like. And it's not like super like, whoa, you're going to be burning off all this weight, but I like to do it all the time. And so it's more important that you do it consistently than that you burn off like, 25 pounds in a month or something like that, right? So it's the healthier way to look at things is more about like a long-term lifestyle type of a situation. So when you take a look at your calories, we typically always think of the 2,000 calorie diet. That's what most of our nutritional stats is based on. And that's kind of average for the most part. This is your max. That's if you're doing nothing, right? So you don't want to eat more than 2,000 calories if you're just sitting on the couch most of the time. And this is the number that we typically have for women. Typically for men, it's a little bit higher. And so it's around 2,500 or so. But that's your max calorie, right? So when you're taking a look at your daily value, those percentages, that's with these in mind. Now, generally speaking, the average nutritional stat is based on 2,000. So if you're a male, that percentage is going to be a little bit less. And if you're a female, that's going to be about spot on. Now, of course, that depends on how many calories you're taking in. I mean, if you're eating like 4,000 calories a day, then expect to gain some weight because you're going to be eating a ton more energy than your body is requiring, especially if you're not exercising. Okay. Notice how everything's relative. It's not necessarily how much you eat. It's how much you eat relative to what your body needs and relative to the kind of exercise you're doing, right? You don't want to just not eat. But what you want to do is you want to eat within balance of what your body is doing. And that's kind of the name of the game of nutrition, isn't it? It's not necessarily about don't eat this or don't do that. It's more about balance. Don't do only this or don't do only that, right? And that's kind of the reason why in the West we're a little dysfunctional when it comes to food, is because what we think of as a strategy is instead of, more of a balanced type of a diet, what we tend to do is we just basically sort of oscillate between extremes. So we go from, say, for instance, eating an all-carb diet, and then we realize we're flirting with diabetes, and then we go to like the zero-carb diet, right? So that's an extreme in the opposite direction. So the whole point isn't that you neutralize one bad choice with another bad choice. It doesn't work like that, right? It's not like subtraction, right? It's about balance. Your body can tolerate just about anything as long as you don't get out of balance. Like I said, it's okay to eat the Oreo, just don't eat the entire bag, right? It's okay to eat a piece of cake, just don't eat the entire cake, right? So it's always about excess, and that's the Western sickness, really. That's the problem with the West, is we are binge eaters. We are a supersized society, right? And that's kind of the problem. We're not very good at balance. but that's what your body wants. So if you take a look at MyPlate, which is myplate.gov, kind of is one of these diet. There's a lot of good dietary websites out there. MyPlate is a good one that'll kind of help. Some of these will help you do meal planning and things of that nature. My personal favorite is nutritiondata.com, because what you can do with nutritiondata.com is you can actually cook a meal, and you can actually store the ingredients that you use to cook the meal, and it'll actually come up with and calculate a nutrition label for the meal that you cooked at home from scratch, which is really cool. And not only that, but they also have other types of things there. Like if you go to Wendy's, you know, and get a Dave's single, they've got that in there. So you can see what that nutritional stat actually is. And so you can kind of, if you wanted to, you know, follow your diet, nutrition data is really nice. And there's lots of other types of nutritional data on there as well. It's the only site that I've found that instead of just taking a look at fats as a group, they actually break it down into the different types of fats. Like they'll look at how much linoleic is in this, how much palmitic is in this, and they'll break it into the different types of fats, which is a really helpful, especially if you're kind of like a prescription diet kind of a situation. Like dietitians oftentimes will need that level of information so that they can calculate just how much of a particular fatty acid you're getting if there's a particular problematic one. But from MyPlate, essentially, this is kind of like what you're looking at. So you notice the sense of balance. If you're eating more of something, you're basically loading yourself up with veggies and grains. So that's kind of like your staple. And then you're adding to it fruits and protein and a little bit of dairy in whatever form you choose. Right. So that could be either, you know, milk, cheese, yogurt, whatever. But notice the idea here is balance. You don't just have an entire plate full of meat, right? That would be all purple. That's out of balance. That's an American problem, right? You have a mixture of different things in there. Notice they didn't say protein equals meat. They said protein is protein from whatever form you get it in. So if you're a lacto-ovo vegetarian, that could be eggs for you. Or that could be tofu or something of that, beans, you know, something high in protein. And so that's a really good site to kind of look at. In general, when you're taking a look at the different types of foods that generally give you health, so generally fresh over processed, right? So if you can get fresh fruit and you can afford it, because produce can be expensive, then by all means, that's what you want, right? As opposed to canned fruit. Although canned fruit is acceptable, right? We've kind of given on that one. Back in the day, it used to be like, no, you don't eat anything in a can. Now we're like, okay, if that's the only way you're getting your fruit, then by all means eat it. That's better than nothing, right? So there's a little bit of realism that's been injected into some of this nutrition information. But veggies, obviously, right? I mean, we grow up thinking, eat your fruits and veggies, right? That's kind of something we hear about all the time. Grains, not the processed refined ones, but the whole grains, right? So we want the whole nutrition in the grain. And if you're getting dairy products, try to use either low-fat, fat-free types of products. So generally speaking, colors are good. There's some diets out there that go by color, right? So your dark green leafies are typically very good in both roughage and nutrients. Orange vegetables like carrots and things of that nature typically tend to be very good because carrots are high in beta carotene, which is an antioxidant. Protein sources, beans typically are good. Peas are also good source of protein and fiber as well. And so if you like peas, then good. If you like beans, good. Now they're not, when they say dry beans, they're not telling you to just go get like a dry wheat bag of black beans or something like that and just start crunching on them. I mean, that's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is like cooking beans from scratch, as opposed to buying them in a can, which typically tends to have a lot of salt in it and different sorts of things in it. But nevertheless, it's better than nothing. So potatoes are very starchy. And so the old days of the meat and potatoes diet from the old West, that's not necessarily the best diet in the world, right? High lipids, high starch. Corn is also starchy, right? So these are high in carbs. And so in order to kind of keep balance, you want to kind of moderate the amount of the high starches you eat. We already talked about whole grains, and then fruits, which can have lots of sugar in them, but it's natural sugar as opposed to refined sugar, can be actually a very pleasant substitute for sugar, right? So if there's a particular fruit that you like, then don't be shy about it. All right. Matter of fact, one of the things I did when I was in college, a couple of things, dietary issues, because I was just crazy. One of the things I did was I basically just stopped drinking milk, like altogether. Not because I didn't like milk, I love milk, but I just stopped drinking milk. Because when I take in zoology, the one thing I learned was that humans are the only animals that continue drinking milk after the age of 2. So I was like, well, I'm an adult, so I'm not a kid, so my bones aren't growing and I don't really need it. So I just cut it out. And even now, I drink milk now, but I don't drink it the way I used to. I mean, I used to drink glass after glass after glass. And so I just kind of cut it out. The other thing I also did was that I limited, just to see if I could do it. This is the weird things I do to myself, right? But one of the things that I did was I basically said, I'm only going to allow myself 40 grams of processed sugar a month. And that's it. So what that means is, like, when you look at the nutritional labels, like on a Coke can, it says, you know, how many carbs are in here, and it says like 40 grams. That's a month, and I'm done. No more processed sugar after that. So as an out, what I did to help train myself was I allowed myself to eat as much fruit as I wanted. So I didn't count fruit as part of the sugar fast. And I did that for a while, and it worked. It was, don't ask me why I did that. I just decided to see, I wonder if I could do this, right? I mean, this is something I can do. And it wasn't that bad, because what I found is when I got my sweet tooth going, I would just eat one of my favorite fruits. And I would just save money. Instead of buying a Coke, which can be expensive, I just decided to buy a banana instead, or an apple, or some other fruit that I really liked. And so that's kind of what I did. So I was trying to train myself into eating better by eliminating the processed stuff and by allowing myself free access to the better choices. So, and some people complain about, you know, fruit as well. So, well, there's sugar in fruit. Yeah, of course there is, but it's also natural sugar. It's a natural source. So you can't just not eat everything. That's one of the problems. If you read too many books, you'll find out that there is not a darn thing on this planet you can do that won't kill you. I mean, don't eat this, don't eat that, don't eat this. And then by the time you finish about 3 paragraphs in a couple of books, you realize there's not a thing on this earth that you can't eat. I mean, you can't eat anything. It's like, I can't go to this because that's going to kill me this way. I can't go to this one because that one's going to kill me this way. I can't do this because that's going to kill me this way. And so the message is, you're screwed. Doesn't matter what you put in your mouth, whatever it is, according to these books, it's all going to kill you. That's the reason why you don't read books, right? Because at some point, the idea is all about balance, right? And that's the one thing that none of these books are talking about. It's all about balance. So what else do you want to toss into your diet? Meat, if you're a meat eater, make sure it's lean meat, right? Like when we go shopping for hamburger, we look for the 97% lean stuff. Poultry is typically fairly lean. Fish, right? The white meats are fairly lean as well. If you like fish, of course, if you don't like fish, then that's okay as well. If you do consume oils, look for on the nutrition labels mono and polyunsaturated fats, because those typically tend to be more cardiovascular supportive than the other types of fats. And so you don't want to eat large stuff, like stuff that's kind of lardy, or that has a lot of saturated fats in it. I'm thinking of like a donut. Absolutely wonderful invention. It's basically a sponge for grease and sugar. That's essentially what it is. I mean, you could take a Scotch Brite and dip that in oil, put a little sugar on it, and that essentially would be a donut. So there's almost zero nutritional value. But how do you know it's saturated fat? It's very simple. When it cools off, what is it like? Right? A good example is McDonald's French fries, right? When they're hot, they're delicious. When they cool off, they're kind of like, ugh, right? Or have you ever had something, and oftentimes I pick on donuts and I love them, but I pick on them still, right? Like when they get cold, they kind of get that sort of like you're eating a spoonful of lard, right? They're cold and you kind of bite into it. It tastes good, but then you kind of get that little kind of fatty film on the roof of your mouth. And you're like, it's like that's saturated fats. That's because it's a solid. And basically it's kind of sticking to the inside of your mouth. Which I may have either made you hungry for donuts or I may have just turned you off on donuts. It's one way or the other, right? But that's kind of what a saturated fat, kind of give it the what is it like when it's cold test, right? It's kind of like a little piece of a lard, then that's probably saturated. Trans fats, basically processed, right? Stay away from processed fats. So all the goodies, Oreos, I'm afraid, my big Achilles heel. I got a lot of Achilles heels actually nutritionally, but Oreos, that's a trans fat one, right? Any of those pastries that when you make from scratch, you know they have a fairly small shelf life or a short shelf life, but when you buy them packaged, they last forever. Those are trans fats that are doing that, right? So stay away from those. That's the reason why I say if you basically are into baked goods, don't buy them, make them. Because when you make them, you won't put trans fats in them. And so there'll be an immediate improvement over buying it, right? So don't buy your cookies, make your cookies. And of course, foods that have cholesterol in it, salt in it, alcohol, try to stay away from those. And then of course, and I didn't notice it didn't say just cut them all out. It just, be measured about it, right? Be balanced about it. Don't just go hog wild on them. And then of course, do something with your body. Be physical. Don't just sit on the couch, but be active. Now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say go buy a membership at 24-hour fitness, right? So don't do that. Typically at those fitness clubs, they're powerfully dysfunctional. Half of the time there's more quackery in one of those buildings than is in any books that you can read. Because a lot of times their focus is completely off. The balanced way to view diet and activity is to view it from a physiological point of view. And when you view it from a physiological point of view, you're going to have a balanced outlook to it, right? If you're thinking about adding fuel to your body and then burning that fuel in exercise and activity, then typically you'll stay relatively in balance. But when you go to one of these clubs, you're obsessed with body image, and that's never a healthy pathway to go down. When you're obsessed with body image, that usually leads to dark places. Okay, and that usually leads to dark places because you'll usually do crazy quackery types of things with your diet. I mean, just ridiculous things. Like, why in the world would you take that? Oh, because somebody said that gives you, whatever. It's like, okay, so if they told you to go stand in front of a firing squad, would you do it? I mean, there's a lot of quackery inside some of these buildings. No, when we're saying be physically active, we're basically saying give your body something to do. Matter of fact, coming from a cardiology background, we used to always talk to our patients because at that point, oftentimes they're in the cardiology office because of what they've eaten in their life, their bad dietary habits, and also their bad physical habits as well. So they oftentimes have a very poor diet choice and combined with a sedentary lifestyle. Those are two things that go very poorly if they're in combination. So no, what we'd oftentimes do is we would help coach our patients in terms of, just exactly this, right? So just cut down on some of these things. We're not asking you to be perfect. We're just, like, if you could just cut down on maybe 5% of your fat intake, we're not, then that's good. Stick with that. Remember, it's all about sustainability, not about perfection. If you can do it for a long term, absolutely do it. Even if it's not perfect, do it for a long time, because that's more important than being able to have the immaculate diet for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden reality hits and your inner mammal wins. And then all of a sudden you're back to eating donuts again, right? That's what happens. And so with physical exercise, it's the same thing. It's like, don't go to the gym and do anything that they tell you to do, right? Instead, just be physical. As a matter of fact, for our heart patients, because oftentimes they tend to be somewhat elderly, we would oftentimes tell them, it's like, listen, as you get older, for you, physical exercise has got to change, right? When we're young and when we're 20s, I mean, we're athletic. We can take on wear and tear. We can take on injury. I mean, we can blow an ACL and then we can be back on the slopes the next morning, right? But as you get older, your body doesn't rebound as well from injury, and it tends to accumulate wear and tear. So that powerlifting CrossFit routine that you did when you were 20 is idiocy when you're 40, because your body is now more prone to wear and tear, which means your physical exercise has got to shift along with it. So as you get older, it's not just working out, it's working out in a smart, intelligent way. Because the real danger for you is that if you work out the way they tell you to work out in the gym, which is fine for when you're 20, but when you're 40 is bad advice. You're going to accumulate more wear and tear on your body than any benefits, because your body simply can't handle that kind of activity anymore. As you get older, that gets worse. So when you have a cardiac patient who's coming into your office and they're asking, okay, what does physical exercise look like for me? I'm 70. And it's like, well, first of all, there's a good chance that you're mostly walking on cartilage in most of your joints. A lot of your connective tissue in the other joints probably is pretty well broken down as well. Your bones are probably losing density. And your muscles have been atrophying since the age of 40. So for 30 years now, your muscles have been atrophying. And your muscle mass has been dwindling. So let me tell you what not to do. Don't do anything stupid, right? Don't go out there gung-ho and start bench pressing your body weight. Matter of fact, a lot of our doctors just basically said, listen, I want you to start off by walking around the block. But don't just walk around the block, do it every day. Make that your morning routine. Get a cup of coffee, whatever, walk around the block, go grab a friend, walk around the block, right? And just do that every day. Because it's more important that whatever you do it consistently than that you do a lot of it. So it's better that you do 5 minutes of physical exercise a day and do it every day than it is to do an hour worth of exercise a day and only do it once a week. Does that make sense? That's called physiological exercise, and that's what we're talking about here. Training your body to be active because your body wants to be active, but it doesn't want to get beat up by the activity. And that's the reason why you see a lot of seniors, like their exercise of choice is walking. I mean, you'll see older people just walking the dog or just kind of walking with their friends and they're just walking around the neighborhood. That's because that is a low wear and tear exercise that they can do easily to keep their bodies active and to improve a lot of their outcomes. And exercise, just to let you know, exercise for the human body is like magic. Literally, I mean, every time we take a look at physical exercise, and we're not talking about beating people up, right? Just that's what we're talking about. We're just talking about low level, just activate your body, get it working, and just engage it in some sort of physical activity. Your body just absolutely eats that up. It improves so many physiological metrics. It doesn't, and half of the time, we don't even really understand how it does it. Like, for instance, even things you wouldn't even think about would be exercise. For instance, somebody with cancer, we've actually seen this, right? Somebody who has like cancer. We say, let's just kind of, be active, do something physical active, just something low pressure. Don't beat yourself up. If you're tired, let yourself rest. If you're energetic and you're ready for it, then go do whatever you're going to do, walk around the block. And we've noticed that people who exercise, their cancers are actually very responsive as opposed to somebody who just sort of lays on the couch. And so we don't understand it. We don't understand why there's all these different positive metrics that go along with exercise, but it's something your body just absolutely craves to do. Your body was designed to move, not to grow roots on a couch. Right? So that's the reason why physical exercise is key. And don't let the the gym rats shame you into saying like, oh, well, that's not really exercise. Sure it is. Sure it is. It's not dumb exercise like they're doing, but it's exercise, right? It's keeping your body active, keeping it moving, keeping all these positive things happening in your body, and you reap the benefits for it. And I like that too, because when you think of it in physiological sense, it's all about, it goes back to our mantra, right? It's all about sustainability. It's not about running a marathon when you're 70. It's about walking around the block and doing it every day or as many times as you can. If your body will allow you to do it, do it. But if your body says, no, then don't do it. And don't feel bad about it, right? So listen to your body. That's a hard thing to do, right? Is to listen to your body. A lot of people have no clue how to listen to their body. But typically those who do learn how to listen to your body go much better because you know what your body needs and what it doesn't. Okay. I'm still learning, by the way, if you're wondering. I'm not very good at listening to my body. So I'm still learning the types of messages my body's sending. Like, for instance, I probably shouldn't have ridden my bike today because my shoulder hurts and it probably doesn't want the aggravation of being on my bike for almost an hour. So I probably should have taken the day off. And I'm listening now. Just want to get home, and I'm going to take the next couple of days off and see where I am on Friday. But that's kind of one of those things where it's like, I want to get on my bike and I want to work out. I want to ride. I could ride forever if I could, if my body would let me, but it won't. So I have to be careful to listen. The same thing's true. As you get older, you need to listen better to what your body's telling you. So what about some disorders of eating? So eating disorders, right? These always come up. So typically, when you take a look at an eating disorder, you're taking a look at something that has obviously a lot going on. So there's emotional roots to it, certainly, right? There's cultural roots, there's social, biological. So there's all kinds of things going on in eating disorders. And this is the reason why they're so difficult to work with, is because it's not just a thing. It's usually a confluence of lots of different types of pressures coming in. And then they kind of manifest themselves as sort of this eating sort of situation. So we have a couple of, so the first one is anorexia that we'll take a look at. So this is basically generally kind of a fear of getting fat, so psychological phobia, generally speaking. And what happens is you tend to self-induce starvation. You just basically stop eating. You know, you can either do this a couple of ways, right? So either physical activity, or with low caloric intake. So you're intentionally cutting off the calories. And this is one of the reasons why we always say it's like, you want to reduce your calories to what you need, but you don't want to just stop eating, right? So every doctor will tell you, it's like, just cut back. Don't stop eating, right? Because then what's going to happen is you're going to start to see some results. You will lose weight if you stop eating. There's no question about that. But the problem is you're going to start to physically get into some very, very difficult areas where your body's not going to start functioning very, very well. Okay. And if you combine that then with the psychological perspective of the fear of getting fat, and this is a situation where there's like an extreme piece to this, right? So for instance, somebody who's anorexic will, regardless of how skeletal they look or how much weight they've lost, they will always see themselves as fat, even if they have very little fat on them. And that's kind of where the psychological piece to it becomes a body image psychology associated with. Bulimia is another one, not the same, but related. In this particular case, what's going to happen is you binge eat. So you eat a bunch of foods, and then afterwards you basically purge, you vomit it all back up. And the reason why you do that is to avoid weight gain. And so this is something that people started doing as a way to avoid weight gain. I know the Romans are always picked on for this, right? The Epicureans, where they go in and this kind of have the glutton fest to kind of eat themselves into a coma practically, and then they go into a room and they vomit it all up and they keep eating again and that sort of thing. but this is like one of those things where it becomes a habit. This is sort of like becomes like your weight management strategy. So rather than taking a healthy approach and just regulating your caloric intake with your caloric demand so that it's in balance, you kind of just sort of oscillate between these two very extremes. You're just binge eating. You're eating it more than you need, right? And then you just do the opposite extreme, which is basically you purge it all out. And so as a result, your body tends not to get the nutrients that it needs because you're oftentimes purging all the time. And so what? Well, yeah, it does, because if you don't absorb it, then it all comes out and you won't do weight gain. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like a situation where it's like you have to kind of you kind of have to work on that one. And there's been all sorts of, I remember in the 80s we first started to kind of understand bulimia. There's that were being made to kind of like to kind of show people like the realities of it, where people were getting into bulimia and they're having to like kind of come to this sort of intervention point where they're like, oh, I need to get myself under, I need to kind of figure out how to kind of pull this under control again, right? Because yeah, I mean, it's like, because remember, the idea is sustainability and balance, not oscillating from one extreme to the next. Your body doesn't respond to that well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's because what happens is anytime you do something like that, your body adapts. And then oftentimes will adapt into ways you don't want it to adapt into. So, and that's one thing. So binge eating is just kind of like bulimia without the purging. So the old days, we used to call this gluttony, right? Where you just basically eat and eat and eat and eat. And a lot of things can trigger this. So a lot of people are stress eaters, anxiety eaters, right? So you eat when you're angry. Notice the emotional piece, right? So comfort food, oftentimes it starts off as like, oh, I'm just going to go and, I'm angry or I'm stressed out and I'm just going to go eat a carton of ice cream. And that's kind of how it starts. And so this just becomes like an ongoing kind of a thing, but you can see it oftentimes in individuals. It's very clear that the eating isn't, because you'll ask them, it's like, okay, so you're eating all these calories, right? Like some 4,000 calories or something like that a day. And you'll ask them a question. So you're eating, but why are you hungry? Because that's the idea. I mean, the idea of you're eating, usually it should be accompanied first by hunger. That's your body telling you that you need food. But oftentimes what happens is they're eating and it's like, are you hungry? And they're like, no, I'm not hungry. Then why are you eating? And it's usually because there's some sort of underlying situation like this, like a stress eating or something of that nature. And that's pretty common. That's the reason why a better stress release instead of eating would be exercise, right? Some people, when they get angry, they go for a run and they just kind of get that out physically, right? Or you might have the punching bag downstairs and you just go around on your punching bag, right? Take faces to the punching bag and just pretend like you're punching the lights out of somebody in effigy, right? So there's those as well, right? So sometimes you can also get sort of stress induced physical, like over exertion types of situations with working out as well. It's not as common. And that actually kind of turns into what our next one is kind of like a dysmorphia situation. In this case, muscular dysmorphia is essentially when you're always thinking your body's underdeveloped. It's kind of like anorexia, where you always see fat on your body, regardless of whether there's fat there or not. In this case, you always see your body's underdeveloped, regardless of whether or not you have these hulking muscles that are just 9 times their normal size. And so you see this a lot of times in bodybuilding, that it becomes obsessive, where you're obsessing about getting more bulk. And so you'll oftentimes start to obsess about your diet and different types of tricks, oftentimes um, to the detriment of your body itself. You see this a lot actually in the gym. It's one of the reasons why I say don't go to the gym. If you're just trying to do physical activity, don't go to the gym. Just do something you can do. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can do that you don't have to get a gym membership for, right? If you like swimming, swimming pools are easy to get a hold of. You don't have to go to a gym for that, right? Even if you like a particular type of equipment, oftentimes if you want to get into that sort of thing, you can actually purchase some pretty affordable types of equipment, and do it in your home, right? Or something like that. But typically what tends to start to accumulate the lifers in the gym typically are these body dysmorphics, right? So they are always in the gym working on themselves. This one comes after men. So whereas anorexia and bulimia tends to go after women, this one goes after men. So muscular dysmorphia is sort of like the male version of sort of off-balance body perception. Okay. Every time I teach an AMP, it's always somebody, there's always at least one student in there. Either they themselves or they have friends who are in the gym with them, and they tell me about some of these crazy things that they're taking. And I tell them, it's like, okay, why? That's just dumb. Like, one of my students last spring, could have been last fall, said one of his friends was taking insulin. He's not a diabetic. He was taking insulin for muscle bulk, for bulking up muscle. And I was explaining to him in my relatively controlled rage that, number one, there's actually people with diabetes who need that insulin. So I'm not very happy if somebody who's perfectly fine is basically taking necessary medicine away from somebody else. And the other one is, that's the stupidest thing on the face of the planet you can do, is pump a bunch of crap in your body because somebody said that you would get more muscle. And then basically it may work, you may get a little bit more muscle, but you're probably going to be dead before you're 30. Bravo. So what would you rather do? Bigger muscles or longer life? Depends on the person. But either way, that's an example of some stupid things that I hear about coming out of gyms. Okay. So that is the end of chapter 9. Now we're going to dig into chapter 11. Okay. Urinary system. We've got respiratory, digestive, and now we're heading into urinary. So let's go ahead and kind of get ourselves started. We'll frame the system itself. There's a lot of things that the urinary system does. One of the major ones that it does is it'll help the body maintain the salt water balance and also the homeostasis of pH in the blood itself. And of course, we think of the urinary system as the excretion system, and it does that as well, right? Because what it'll do is it'll clean up the blood and it'll screen the blood of all metabolic waste, usually nitrogenous waste, which are highly water soluble. And then those typical waste products are the byproducts associated with what the tissues are doing as they're kind of going through their metabolism. They're generating these metabolic wastes, and then they're dumping that into the bloodstream. And then ultimately that will be screened by the kidneys, and those wastes will be picked up and then eliminated from the body by in the form of urine. So it'll dump all of those metabolic wastes into the urine stream, and you'll just basically get rid of that. So what are the types of wastes that are being produced? So most of these are nitrogenous, basically highly water soluble. So things like urea is one of them. Creatinine, ammonium, that's very soluble. Uric acid is also very soluble. Urea basically comes from amino acids. So it comes from the amino part of an amino acid. And this is going to be a lot of the metabolic waste in urine. And so generally speaking, when you break down your amino acids, the amino side of it, right, that's will be released as ammonia. Now, ammonia is pretty harsh stuff. You don't want ammonia to be hanging around your body. Okay, so that's pretty toxic. And so what you do is you convert that typically into ammonium, and that will combine the ammonia with CO2, and then basically that'll turn it into urea. So ammonium is basically the soluble version of ammonia. Ammonia is kind of gaseous, but ammonium is the soluble version of ammonia. So when you are producing urea, you're essentially taking that amino byproduct of amino acid metabolism and you're getting rid of it. Nitrogenous compounds in general are pretty nasty, and so you want to get rid of them. And so if you have uremia, you usually have a lot of urea in your blood. So you have either a lot of amino acid metabolism, or you just have a lot of retention of urea. And so the consequences of having too much urea in your system can cause a lot of things that we typically probably don't think of the kidneys. So for instance, it can cause arrhythmia. That's basically a malfunction of that conduction system in your heart, your SA node. So that's an arrhythmia event. It can cause you to vomit, or if you have respiratory problems, things of that nature. If it gets really, really bad, it can kill you. But generally speaking, for the most part, unless you have like kidney damage, your kidneys are pretty good at getting rid of it. So seeing uremia in a healthy individual is pretty rare. It's usually a marker of kidney damage. So what about the others? So creatinine and uric acid. So creatinine comes from creatine phosphate, which is an anaerobic source of energy. It's an energy molecule that your muscles use when you don't have enough oxygen to create ATP. So this is an anaerobic source of energy. And so generally speaking, you will get rid of that through your kidneys. And uric acid is basically coming from nucleic acids. So when you have nucleotides, which is DNA, right? So these are this will start to create uric acid from the nitrogenous bases. Of your nucleotides. And if you have too much, uric acid can be insoluble. If it forms crystals, you have too much, and the crystals in your joints will create gout. Right. So if you have a lot of uric acid, you're not clearing that uric acid out, then that'll start to accumulate as crystals in your joints, and that creates what we refer to as gout. And so that's always a little problem. So that's your excretion functions of the urinary system. I would argue probably a more important function of the urinary system is the water-salt balance. And so ultimately, when you take a look at water-salt balance, remember, we're using salt, in this case sodium chloride, as the osmotic lure to dictate the direction of water flow by osmosis. And so ultimately, then what happens is the more salt you have, then the more osmotic flow of water you have. So manipulating water in your body requires salt. And that's kind of where you get your water-salt balance idea from. And so the idea is if you've got a lot of salt in your blood, typically what will happen is you have greater blood volume. So essentially that water is going to come into the blood because it's going to be chasing the salt. That's what osmosis does. It chases the salty concentrations, and that's going to increase your blood volume, which will increase your blood pressure. So if you have too much salt in your bloodstream, it's going to basically create a situation where you have too much water in your bloodstream, creating a high blood pressure. In order to regulate that blood pressure, then what you have to do is you have to offload some of that water. You do that by basically offloading the salt. So you notice that basically manipulating your water levels in your body typically comes along with manipulating the water levels in your, manipulating the salt levels in your body. So that's kind of how you do it. So the main one, for instance, the concentration of your sodium will be dictated and manipulated by your kidneys in order to regulate blood pressure. And so the more, blood volume you need on one side, then the more likely you're going to pile up that sodium, and you're going to cause water to chase after. That'll increase your blood pressure. Okay. So they also regulate bicarbonate ion and calcium ion as well in your kidneys. And so these are also important. Now, the acid-base balance, this is the pH balance. This is another thing your kidneys will do. Your physiological pH, remember, is about 7.4. That's what your body fluids are, that's what your blood plasma is, that's what your tissues are. It's about 7.4. So to maintain that, what your kidneys oftentimes have to do is regulate the pH by getting rid of or urinating out excess hydrogen ion. Remember, we have water plus CO2 gives us carbonic acid, which dissociates into hydrogen ion plus bicarb, right? And so if you have an increase in this, you're going to have a decrease in pH. It's going to become more acidic. And so one of the ways that you can do this, remember we said before in the respiratory system, the way you do this with the respiratory system is you back it all up and you breathe out the CO2. Well, there's another way that you can regulate pH. You can basically take this and essentially dump it into the urine stream. And when you do that, you'll be getting rid of the acidity. And then that will basically allow you to regulate that blood pH. Normally speaking, because of this, your urine comes out a little on the acidic side, because you're constantly regulating that pH. You're constantly regulating the amount of hydrogen ion that you actually have in your body at any one time. So along with the regulation of salt and water, you also have important hormones that are regulating this. So for instance, the kidneys, in response to blood pressure, will release a hormone called renin. Now what renin does, just kind of show you the full thing here. Is in your system, you have an inactive enzyme because of the ogen suffix called angiotensinogen. That is converted into an active form, angiotensin 1, and it's done so by renin. Now, renin itself angiotensin 1 will then go to the lungs, where it'll be converted by what's called the angiotensin converting enzyme into angiotensin 2. We oftentimes know this as vasopressin. So this is basically has a lot of different activities in terms of regulating blood pressure. And one of the activities that it has is to regulate aldosterone, which is coming from the adrenal glands. It's coming from the adrenal cortex, which is above the kidneys. And what aldosterone does is its job is to retain sodium in the blood. Of course, what happens when you retain sodium in the blood? You have a high salt pile. Where does the water go? It chases the salt. So if you retain salt in your blood, then the water is going to come right after that, and it's going to fill into your blood and increase your blood volume and increase your blood pressure. And this will be done by osmosis. Another hormone that the kidneys make is erythropoietin, which will stimulate the production of red blood cells, which will also be added to the blood and has the effect of increasing blood pressure. So another function of the kidneys in this long list of kidney functions, but a lot of times this is one that people will oftentimes skip over and forget about, but it's important in calcium absorption. Remember, we mentioned that before. And a lot of times people are like, okay, wait a minute. So how is it exactly helpful in calcium absorption? Because what happens is the kidneys will basically release the final active version of vitamin D called calcitriol. And what does vitamin D do? Vitamin D works in the digestive system to help absorb calcium. So if you have a lot of vitamin D or calcitriol coming from the kidneys, and you drink milk, which is high in calcium, or if you take a Tums or something like that, then the extra vitamin D will be able to allow you to absorb more of that calcium. So the two tend to go hand in hand. This is one of the reasons why a lot of times on a vitamin D supplement or a calcium supplement, sometimes you'll see it accompanied with a little spike of vitamin D, is to make sure that you don't just consume this supplement with a lot of calcium in it, but that you also have its co-absorbent so that you can actually get it into your bloodstream. Okay. And so that's important because you need calcium for the hardening of your bones, and you also need calcium for the contraction of your muscles. All right, those are two very important pieces. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the structure and the anatomy of the kidneys. So in the urinary system overall, it's a fairly simple system. There's only a couple of pieces to it. So you have your kidneys. Of course, you have your ureters, which are going from the kidneys and leading to the urinary bladder. So that's basically where you're going to have urine stored in your bladder. And then from there, it's going to be eliminated from your body through the urethra. And so those are the main pieces. Now, when you take a look at the kidneys themselves, the kidneys, generally speaking, will be on either side of your vertebra. So just kind of like lateral to the vertebra itself. And they're kind of underneath the rib cage. They're not completely in the rib cage like your lungs and your heart are. They're kind of exposed more toward the back, just underneath your rib cage. So they do have a little bit of protection from the rib cage, but they're kind of exposed a little bit underneath. So on the left side, so this is on your left-hand side because of your liver. Your kidney is kind of just shifted a little bit down because your liver is sitting right there and kind of pushing it down. So it's kind of taking up some of that space, whereas on the right side, it's elevated a little bit. And so it looks a lot like, well, a kidney bean. And there's a reason why we call a kidney bean because it looks like a kidney, right? And so This is where you're going to find it's going to look very, very distinct, and it's going to be covered by a connective tissue husk called the renal capsule. Okay. And so, generally speaking, on the concave side, where you have what's called the hilum of the kidney, this is where your renal artery is going to come in. So your artery, you have your abdominal aorta, it's coming down like this. Your renal artery will basically shoot off from the abdominal aorta and enter into the concavity of the kidney, the hilum of the kidney. And then in addition to that, you also have the renal vein, which will be coming off of the inferior vena cava, which is usually like right next to it or right above it. And you're going to see that vein coming in as well. So you have both the artery, the renal artery, and the renal vein kind of coming in together. They're actually kind of, I kind of drew them separated, but they're actually kind of more bundled together than not. And then coming out of the same area is going to be the ureter. So the ureter is like a little tube-like structure that will be coming out of the kidneys and heading toward the bladder. I'll make the renal artery red. The vein blue. The ureter, it's got urine in it, I'll make yellow. So it should look something like that. Nice and colorful. Okay. So ultimately then your renal artery will be bringing blood to the kidneys that needs to be screened, and the renal vein will be carrying it away from the kidneys that has been screened and ready for distribution to the rest of the body. So this is kind of what it looks like anatomically. So you can see you have your bean-shaped kidneys. Here you can see your renal artery coming in, your renal vein coming in on both sides. Your adrenal glands are sitting right on top of the kidneys. And then coming out of the kidneys is going to be your ureter, which will connect to the bladder. And then from the bladder, you'll see the urethra coming out as it exits. So the ureters basically are simply a tube, a little bit of musculature associated with that, has 3 layers. And so it's just a little tube that's carrying urine, and its job is to take it from the kidneys and then basically transport it to the bladder itself. Now, like the digestive system, it has a couple of layers to it, right? So it has this inner mucosa layer, which has the epithelial cells to it. Sorry, this is the innermost layer underneath, followed by a layer of smooth muscle. So you do have some contractile ability on your ureter, and then of course the outer fibrous connective tissue coat on the outside of it. And generally speaking, as you move urine through the tube, you're using peristaltic contractions. Remember, we talked a lot about peristalsis in the digestive system as a way to kind of toothpaste your way through the digestive system. That toothpasting is a lot of, that's common throughout your body. And it's a major type of movement to sort of move things through these tubular types of systems, especially when you're looking at things like the ureter itself. Now, in the bladder is just a big pouch. It stores the urine. It has 3 major openings, right? It has 2 for the ureters, 1 from right and left kidney. So you have right and left kidney draining with their respective ureters into the bladder, and then it's got an exit. That's the urethra, which is where you're going to be draining the bladder to the outside world. Now, inside the bladder, if you were to take a look at it, it has this kind of ruffled look, kind of like we saw the inside of the stomach. It's called rugae. These are basically their little wrinkles. And then as the bladder fills, it's going to distend and tighten, and those are going to smooth out, right? So those are going to disappear as the bladder becomes distended and becomes fuller and fuller and fuller. And then the epithelial tissue that we see is the transitional. So this is the one that has the ability to stretch, as a very unique type of epithelial tissue. So in the bladder itself, in the mucosa, one of the things that you have is some valve-like structures, folds, if you will, that prevents backward flow, just like we saw valves anywhere else in the body, right? We saw this in the cardiovascular system. We saw this in other places. This is just prevents backward flow. So you don't want flow of urine going back into the ureter, right? You only want to go unidirectional. So as a result, you basically have these little valve-like folds. And then around the urethra, you have two sphincters. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We just talked about the anal sphincters. You have an internal and an external set. Same thing's true here. You have an internal sphincter in your bladder that has smooth muscle. This is the involuntary one. This is the one that relaxes when your bladder is full. However, you have an external sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. This one you have voluntary control over. This is the one, this is you holding it, right? So even though you have to go, your internal sphincter is relaxed. Your external sphincter is still pinched down because you're holding it, because you realize you're not anywhere near a restroom, right? And so that's your external. By the way, does this sound familiar? It's the exact same system that you had for your anal sphincters, right? You had your internal sphincter that was basically involuntary, and your external anal sphincter that was allowing you to be able to control whether or not the anus opened. In this case, it's the same thing, only now with the bladder. So when you take a look at it, you have this linked to your nervous system. And so these are just sections of your spinal cord. And so when you take a look at it, what you're going to see is in your internal sphincter, you're going to have parasympathetic involuntary fibers, which basically are going to be in control of these internal sphincters. And you don't have control of those, right? So those will relax when the bladder is full. Typically, you'll have a stretch receptor associated with that. And what will happen is that stretch receptor will trigger that parasympathetic communication back to your spinal cord, allowing you to relax those sphincters so that you can actually open up your bladder. However, in a different part of your nervous system, your spinal cord, you're going to have now somatic. The somatic one is the one that's involved in your skeleton, your skeletal system, your skeletal muscles. This is the one that's going to control your skeletal muscles. And so this is your voluntary control. So now you can basically tell your external sphincter muscles to cinch down, to hold on. Not yet. Hold on. And then when we are in the restroom, then I'll go ahead and relax the external sphincters, and then that'll allow you to be able to release. Okay. Pretty much the exact same story that you had with your anal sphincters. So then urination, or micturition, if you want to impress your friends, or not, but that may be a little too nerdy. You just tell them, it's like, guys, I got to go micturate. It's like, what? That'll guaranteed to get you disinvited to any party or any kind of social event if you make it a habit of nerding out on them all the time, right? So basically, what's going to happen is your bladder is going to fill. Your stretch receptors are going to start triggering that involuntary parasympathetic situation. So these sensory nerves are going to signal the spinal cord, and that motor nerve will go to the urinary bladder and cause those internal sphincters to relax so that urination is possible. And then the brain, however, will have control over these external sphincters, disallowing you from urinating until your brain sends a signal to relax, right? And so the urethra then, once you do relax your external sphincters, then the urine will move through the urethra, and it basically goes from the bladder to the external opening. In females, it's a fairly short length. And generally speaking, it's a little bit longer in males, generally speaking, because it goes through the prostate and it goes into the penis and then out. And so, because it goes through the prostate, when the prostate is enlarging, it can cinch down on that urethra, causing a sensation of urgency. So, that's a common symptom of enlarging prostate in a male. Is they'll feel like they need to go, and then when they get ready to go, they can't do anything because the prostate is pinching on the urethra, creating a sensation of having to go, but it's blocking the passageway. And so, in females, the reproductive system and the urinary system are not connected. So the urethra and the vaginal opening are next to each other, but not connected. However, in males, they are. So essentially, the urethra is the passageway through the penis for elimination of urination, but it's also the same passageway for sperm delivery as well. So both sperm and urine use the same passageway in the urethra. And so that's kind of the structure of the whole thing. Now let's kind of drill down on the kidneys and focus a little bit more on the kidneys, and we'll kind of get a little bit more detailed with the kidneys, especially as we start to get to micro anatomy of the kidney, especially with the nephrons. And that's kind of where the real important part is happening. Nephrons are to kidneys what capillaries are to the cardiovascular system, right? That's where all the important physiology is happening. But a kidney itself can be broken up into regions. First of all, the outermost region is going to be the renal cortex. And so the below that is going to be the renal medulla, the inner portion. And this has cone-shaped structures. It's divided up into cone-shaped structure called renal pyramids. And then those will lead to another structure called the renal pelvis, which is like a central opening, almost like the collection cup of a funnel that basically collects urine. So when you take a look at it, what you're going to see is you're going to see the cortical region. So the cortical region is basically going to be this outermost region here. That's your renal cortex. And then your medulla is pretty much everything below that. So this whole area right in here, this would be basically your renal medulla. And the medulla is broken up into these triangular-like structures called the renal pyramids. Now, one thing I want to point your attention to is notice how the vasculature that's coming into the kidneys breaks up and wraps around these renal pyramids. So, for instance, you can see how the renal artery will basically go up these little stalk-like passageways called renal columns, and it will basically deliver blood to the rest of the kidneys and sort of break up and then sort of wrap around the renal pyramids, and it'll kind of come back down. Okay, so you can see how basically these renal pyramids are basically wrapped around with this material. So this is a cleaned up version of it. So this is your renal cortex on the outside. Then the renal medulla, which is going to be the innermost portion, and the pyramid, which is going to be one of these little triangular pieces here. Now, generally speaking, what happens is the renal pelvis is the entrance point, typically associated with the beginning of the urine. So you can think of this region as as a funnel, right? So we're basically, this is the top part of the funnel, and then this becomes the stem of the funnel, right? So basically, urine basically comes down into the renal pelvis and then drains down into the ureter on its way to the bladder. Okay. Now, the important thing to remember is that when you take a look at the structure of the kidney, the renal pyramid, so this is one renal pyramid, is basically where you're making the urine. So ultimately what's going to happen is you have this tubular system called the nephron, which you can see here. So these are all the little tubules of where you're going to be making your urine. And it's going to share pieces of it are going to be in the renal cortex, and part of it's going to dip down into the renal medulla. And then you're going to drain urine out of these little hole-like structures into the renal pelvis. So if you take a look at our kidney again, basically your tubular system is up here, and then it's going to be making urine, and it's going to be draining that urine down in these long tubules, which are in this renal pyramid. And those long tubules are going to connect to this area right here, and it's going to drizzle down urine into this like little collection area. This area right here is what we refer to as a minor calyx. Now, generally speaking, when the urine collects into the minor calyx, it will merge together in a larger opening where you have multiple minor calyxes merging together. This region of merger we oftentimes refer to as a major calyx. And so you can see urine coming out of all these little holes, and then they're kind of merging into these major calyxes. So there's a couple of those, and then those will merge together into the pelvis, and then it'll drain down into the ureter. Think of it as sort of like tributaries coming together, draining into a major river, right? So that's kind of what it's like. But ultimately, the important thing is the renal pyramid. Now, the main structure that we think of in terms of making urine is the nephron. And so we have lots of them. So there's millions of nephrons in a kidney. And so what the nephrons do is their job is to filter the blood and to make the urine. And once they make the urine, they drain it into the collecting duct, which is that long duct-like system here that's draining the urine down into the minor calyx, and it'll drain into ultimately the renal pelvis for delivery to the through the ureter to the bladder. So this is the physiological hotspot. This is where all the physiology of the urinary system is happening, is in this nephron structure. And these little tubular systems up here, these are the nephrons. And we're going to take a look at what happens in those areas. So the first thing we need to understand is that a nephron begins as a capillary. And that capillary has a specific name called the glomerulus. So this is basically a capillary knot that's fed from the renal artery by an afferent arteriole. Remember, we said the arterioles were the small vessels of the arterial system taking blood into the capillary bed. And so you have the same thing here. Afferent is to be distinguished between efferent. I think of afferent as arrival. So this is where your arriving blood comes to. It comes through the afferent from the renal artery, and it goes through this little tangle of capillaries called the glomerulus, and it's covered by a tubular capsule called the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. Then what happens is the blood will then be carried away from the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole, so E for exit. So this will head back out to the cardiovascular system on its way to the rest of the body. So now the important thing is that in the blood system, the blood pressure in the glomerulus is high. So it's higher actually than anywhere else in the body. Why? Simple. Because the outlet is narrower than the inlet. So it's easy to get out, not so easy, or it's easy to get in, not so easy to get out, right? So what happens is, just like a water hose, when you shut down your exit route, all that blood comes into the afferent arteriole, and that builds up in there, and it builds up pressure. And so only a little bit of you is getting out, but more of you is getting in. So it builds up pressure in there. And that pressure is important because you have to be able to sift out your blood, and you need that pressure to be able to do it. Now, where does it go from the efferent arteriole? Well, now it goes to a series of capillaries that surround the nephron. So one of them is what's called the peritubular capillary network. This surrounds the rest of the nephron. This allows molecules to re-enter the blood from your tubular nephron system. Now from here, as it wraps around the nephron, it's going to be moving into a venule, and then it'll be off to the cardiovascular system. So this is kind of what it looks like. So let's take a close look at it. First of all, these are actual scanning electron micrographs of a glomerulus. So here you'll see the glomerular capsule wrapped around a glomerulus. And these are little individual glomeruli. It's been colorized so that you can see it better. So each one of these little tangles, these little ball-like tangles, these are individual glomeruli. That's these things right here. First of all, one thing to notice is that your renal artery is bringing blood into the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole. And then as the afferent arteriole goes in, it basically breaks up into this kind of mess of networked vessels. That's the glomerulus itself. And then as it kind of goes through all of these, then it comes out the efferent arteriole. And from the efferent, it's then going to wrap around the tubular system. This is that peritubular capillary network. Notice it has arterial blood, and then it transitions to this more venous-like blood. It's going to pick up things from the tubular system. It's going to wrap itself around it, and then it's going to re-enter the venous blood system. And then it's going to go through the renal vein back to the heart for redistribution. The blood that is coming back to the renal vein should be clean because you've cleaned it up, right? You've basically sort of sifted out all of the metabolic waste. The idea is the metabolic waste now should be inside the capsule. So let's take a look at the capsule. The first part of the capsule is going to be what's called Bowman's capsule, or the glomerular capsule. It's a epithelial type structure that wraps itself around the glomerulus like this. So here's your glomerulus in here. You have your afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole, and then you have the tubular system. It goes off to the tubule. So this is your capsule. Notice there's space in there. So it's capsular space. So ultimately what you want to do is you want to basically take your blood, which is in your glomerulus, and you want to filter it out so that you can basically get all the metabolic waste in your capsular space and then eliminate that through your urine. And so we're going to be coming back and forth to this particular diagram, because this is going to be our governing diagram for the next several slides, right? So ultimately, the first portion that we run into is this capsule. It's typically made out of squamous epithelial cells. What is that? Flat epithelial cells, right? That's what squamous is, like that. And we covered that in the tissues chapter. Now, typically on the back side of it, you'll have squamous, then you'll have a space, and then laying on top of the glomerulus itself is the other layer of the capsular space that's broken into types of cells called podocytes. So what this actually means is foot cell. That's what podocyte means, foot cell. And so what these guys do is they basically create a sieve-like structure. So these are cells that basically will form these kind of like foot-like appendages like this. And then another cell will come along and form also foot-like appendages and kind of interlace in between the other one. So it's kind of like this. So if these are the little foot-like structures, the extensions of the cell, what happens is they kind of fit together, to interlace together to create these like little itty bitty holes, like a sieve, like the holes in a sieve. They leave pores. And they create a sieve-like structure called the filtration membrane. This is what you are going to be pushing your blood against in order to get that filtration. It's not unlike sifting flour. Have you ever taken flour and put it in a little sifter and then kind of like push the little thing, kind of just sifted it and let the flour fall through it? Well, the big stuff gets left behind, right? I mean, big clods and things like that, those get left behind. But the nice small flour gets to pass through. The same thing's true here. The big things get left behind, but only small things can pass through this little sieve-like filtration membrane. Now then, from the glomerular capsule, you're going to be leading into the first portion of the tubular system called the proximal convoluted tubule, or the PCT. This typically is composed of cuboid cells. So now you're talking about cells that look more like cubes, like this. And they have little extensions, microvilli, that forms a bit of a brush border. This increases your surface area. So now you're starting to move into this area right in here. So this is now your proximal convoluted tubule right in there. So that's your PCT. And what's happening here is basically you're going to start to modify the fluid that gets into the capsule itself. So this is kind of what it looks like in terms of the proximal convoluted tubular cells. So this is a cross section of them. So here you can see, here's the nucleus of the cell, and you see the individual cells, and you can see these like little itty bitty hair-like structures. Those are the little microvilli right there that increases the surface area. This is the lumen. This is essentially where what we refer to as the filtrate is located. Filtrate is a term we use for the urine that's not yet become urine yet. So it's going to go through a lot of modifications. Remember, what happens is you basically take your blood and your blood plasma, you push it against your filtration membrane. All the big stuff stays behind and moves through the capillary system and out the efferent arteriole. But only the small things, small solutes, small metabolites, ions, things like that, can pass through the filtration membrane, the sieve. And fluids can pass through the sieve. So what ends up in the capsular space is basically a fluid that we refer to as filtrate, that at this point looks very similar to plasma. But what you flush down the toilet doesn't look like plasma at all, does it? So there's a lot of modifications we have to do on the filtrate. And the basic of the modifications are essentially us picking and choosing what we want to get rid of and what we don't. As it goes through the tubular system, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking stuff out of the filtrate to hang on to, and we send that through that peritubular capillary system, take it back up in the bloodstream. Or we're going to take some things where we'll be like, you know what, no, I want to get rid of this, and we're going to dump it into the filtrate so that we can eliminate it. So we're constantly taking stuff out, putting stuff in, and we're kind of adding to and taking away all throughout the tubular system until at the end, we get something that looks very different than our plasma. And it looks a little bit more like urine. That process of picking and choosing, adding and subtracting, begins in earnest in the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll start with the nephron loop next time.